Chapter 1. Poverty was a predator that chewed you up slowly. It gnawed at the frayed edges of Kerrigan's sneakers, bit into the aching arch of her spine, and swallowed whatever pride she had left every time she scrubbed a stranger's vomit off the diner floor. But the thing waiting in the alley tonight was not a metaphor. It was real, and it was starving. The rain was an absolute deluge, an icy sheet that turned the city streets into slick, black rivers. Kerrigan marched through the storm, her 5-year-old son, Toby, sleeping against her collarbone. His small, warm breaths puffed against her freezing neck. She smelled like a tragic cocktail of industrial bleach, stale fryer oil, and exhaustion. Her arms were leaden, trembling from carrying his weight for 6 blocks, but the bus pass had expired yesterday. Then a sound sliced through the drumming rain. It was a cry, high, reedy, and choked with absolute terror. Kerrigan stopped. Her worn boots slid on the wet pavement. She tightened her grip on Toby's thighs. Every instinct honed by a life on the brutal side of the city screamed at her to keep walking, to mind her own business. But that sound was not a stray cat. It was a child. She ducked behind a rusted green dumpster at the mouth of the alley. Gently, she lowered Toby into a dry alcove formed by a stack of discarded wooden pallets. He stirred, his dark eyes fluttering open. "Stay here, baby," Kerrigan whispered, her voice rough. She pressed a cold kiss to his forehead. "Do not make a sound. Mommy will be right back." She turned toward the darkness. She had no weapon, only a canister of pepper spray clipped to her belt and whatever she could scavenge. Her hand blindly searched the garbage pile, fingers wrapping around the cold, dented handle of a cast-iron pot lid. It was heavy. It would have to do. Kerrigan crept into the narrow passage. The stench hit her first. It was a foul, gagging odor of wet decay, rotting meat, and ozone that made the hairs on her arms stand up. The shadow shifted. A flash of lightning illuminated the nightmare. It was a wolf, but a colossal, mutated aberration of one. Its spine was hunched and jagged, jutting through patches of missing, diseased fur. Black saliva dripped from jaws that could effortlessly snap a human femur in half. It stalked forward, cornering a tiny figure against a dead-end brick wall. A little girl, no older than 4, huddled in the mud, clutching a soaking wet stuffed rabbit. The beast lowered its massive head, lips curling back to reveal rows of yellowed, fractured teeth. A deep, unnatural rumble vibrated through the alley. Kerrigan did not think. If she thought, she would have realized she was a 100-pound waitress about to attack a supernatural killing machine. The maternal instinct, feral and blinding, simply took over. She broke into a sprint. "Hey!" Kerrigan screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. The monster whipped its head around. In that fraction of a second, Kerrigan closed the distance. She thrust her arm out and pressed the nozzle of the pepper spray, emptying half the can directly into its right eye. The beast let out a deafening roar of agony. It thrashed blindly, claws gouging deep trenches into the asphalt. Kerrigan didn't stop. Using her forward momentum, she swung the heavy iron pot lid with both hands. The metal connected with the bridge of the creature's snout with a sickening, hollow crack. The impact sent a painful shockwave all the way up to her shoulders, nearly dislocating her wrists. The monster staggered back, shaking its colossal head. Then its remaining yellow eye fixed entirely on Kerrigan. The rage in that gaze was ancient and promises of violence. It crouched, the muscles in its hind legs coiling tight like steel springs. Kerrigan froze. The pot lid slipped from her numb fingers, clattering onto the ground. She stepped backward, putting her frail body between the monster and the little girl. This was it. She was going to die in a dirty alley, smelling of cheap soap and fear. She closed her eyes. A shadow detached itself from the building above. There was no sound of a landing, no warning. 1 second, the alley was empty. The next, a man stood between Kerrigan and the beast. He was an imposing silhouette carved directly from the storm. Broad shoulders strained the fabric of a wet, immaculately tailored black suit. He did not flinch. As the mutant wolf lunged, he simply reached out. His bare hands moved faster than Kerrigan's eyes could track. One hand clamped down on the creature's upper jaw. The other seized the matted fur of its throat. The beast thrashed, a violent frenzy of claws and muscle, but the man stood completely rooted. He was unmovable, an apex predator treating a monster like a misbehaving dog. With a brutal, effortless twist of his wrists, a wet, snapping sound echoed off the brick walls. The monster went entirely limp. The man dropped the colossal carcass into a puddle. It landed with a dull splash. Kerrigan's breath hitched in her chest. She stood paralyzed, shivering violently as the rain plastered her hair to her cheeks. The stranger turned around slowly. He was breathtakingly terrifying. Sharp, aristocratic features were cast in shadow, his dark hair slicked back by the rain. He wiped a smear of dark blood from his knuckles using a silk handkerchief. He looked at Kerrigan. His gaze was cold, empty, and thoroughly unimpressed. To him, she was an anomaly. Beneath the heavy curtain of the freezing rain, her scent was entirely masked by harsh lemon degreaser, stale grease, and the sharp metallic tang of human terror. He did not smell a mate. He smelled a foolish, fragile human who had almost gotten his daughter killed. He took a step toward her. Kerrigan shrank back, her pulse hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Suddenly, a wet gurgle erupted from the ground. The rogue was not completely dead. In a final desperate spasm of nervous system and dark magic, the beast's jaws snapped open. It did not aim for the man. It lunged sideways directly toward the alcove where Toby had crawled out, rubbing his sleepy eyes. "Toby!" Kerrigan shrieked, her voice shattering. The stranger moved. He didn't just step. He vanished and reappeared, throwing his imposing frame directly into the beast's path. A sickening tearing sound ripped through the air as the monster's teeth sank into his forearm. The man did not even grunt. With his free hand, he punched straight through the creature's chest, ripping its heart out in a single, fluid motion. The beast finally collapsed, truly dead. Hot, dark blood sprayed in a violent arc, splattering directly across Kerrigan's pale face. She fell to her knees, gasping for air, clutching her son to her chest. The stranger stood over them, the rain washing the gore from his ruined suit. When he looked down at her this time, his human disguise fractured. His irises burned with a blinding, luminous gold, casting an eerie light in the pitch-black alley, the gaze of an alpha king. "Follow me," his voice was a deep, gravelly vibration that rattled her teeth, "or you and the boy will die tonight." Chapter 2. The elevator ascent was entirely silent, save for the faint hum of high-speed machinery. Kerrigan swallowed hard to pop her ears. Her arms ached with a dull, throbbing burn from holding Toby, who had buried his face against her damp collarbone. Beside her stood the stranger. He carried the little girl from the alley effortlessly in one arm. The child was fast asleep, her tiny fingers curled into the ruined lapel of his expensive suit. The polished steel doors glided apart. They did not step into a hallway. The elevator opened directly into a sprawling, glass-walled fortress suspended in the clouds. Kerrigan hesitated. Her worn, mud-caked boots hovered over a pristine expanse of plush ivory carpet. The penthouse smelled of cedar wood, old money, and an intimidating emptiness. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a dizzying panoramic view of the storm-drenched city below. It felt less like a home and more like a beautifully constructed cage. "Keep moving," the man commanded. His voice was a low, resonant baritone that vibrated straight through her ribs. She stepped forward, leaving ugly brown footprints on the immaculate floor. Before she could apologize, a sharp, exasperated sigh echoed through the cavernous living room. A tall, impeccably groomed man strode out of a side corridor. He wore a tailored silver vest and adjusted a pair of wire-rimmed glasses. In his hand, he held a spotlessly clean microfiber cloth. "I spend 3 hours negotiating a treaty with the Northern Covens," the newcomer said, his tone dripping with aristocratic annoyance. "And I return to find you dripping street sludge and rogue blood all over the imported Persian rugs. Really, Vaughn? Were we out of garbage bags?" Vaughn did not look at him. He gently laid the sleeping little girl onto a sprawling leather sofa. "Secure the perimeter, Gareth. We were ambushed in the South End alleyways." Gareth paused. His flippant demeanor vanished instantly. He straightened his posture, his eyes flashing a dangerous steely gray. "How many?" "Just one, a mutated scout," Vaughn replied, rolling his broad shoulders. "But they knew exactly where Sienna was. Someone leaked her schedule." Kerrigan stood entirely still. She clutched Toby tighter. The reality of the situation was crashing down on her like a physical weight. These men were not just wealthy. They spoke of ambushes, scouts, and perimeters. They were an organized, lethal syndicate. And she was a witness. "I want to go home," Kerrigan stated. Her voice shook, but she forced her chin up. "I helped your daughter. You saved my son. We are even. Let us leave." Gareth let out a short, cynical laugh. He dabbed at a speck of blood on the coffee table. "Leave? Human, you just bathed in the blood of a feral rogue. If you walk out those doors, you will be tracked and slaughtered before you reach the subway." "He is right," Vaughn said. He turned to face her slowly. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his jaw and the terrifying, predatory stillness in his posture. "You are under my protection now. You will remain here until the threat is neutralized." "I am not your prisoner," Kerrigan snapped. Adrenaline flushed her skin, overriding her common sense. "I have a job. I have rent to pay. I cannot just vanish into a glass tower because your enemies are terrible at keeping appointments." The room went dead silent. Gareth actually dropped his cloth. Vaughn took a deliberate step forward, then another. He moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, closing the distance between them until he was mere inches away. Kerrigan had to tilt her head back simply to look at him. The sheer physical size of the man was overwhelming. He radiated a scorching, feverish heat. She could smell the rain on his skin, beneath it a scent like crushed pine needles and distant lightning. Vaughn stared down at her. His golden eyes searched her pale, defiant face. For a decade, no one had dared to raise their voice at the alpha king of the obsidian crag. Yet here stood a fragile human, reeking of harsh lemon degreaser and cheap cafeteria food, aggressively defending her territory. The wolf beneath Vaughn's skin did not bristle with anger. It purred. A dark, primal curiosity flared to life inside his chest. He leaned in just a fraction. He could hear the frantic, stuttering rhythm of her heart. He could see the delicate pulse jumping at the base of her throat. "You are not a prisoner," Vaughn murmured. His breath ghosted across her temple, making her shiver violently. "But you are not leaving. Do not test my patience, little bird. I am holding onto it by a very thin thread." He pulled back before she could respond, the sudden absence of his heat leaving her strangely cold. "Gareth will show you to a guest room. Lock the door. Do not come out until sunrise." Hours later, the penthouse was plunged into darkness. In his private study, Vaughn was losing his mind. He gripped the edges of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning stark white. A brutal, agonizing migraine clawed at the inside of his skull. It felt like jagged shards of glass scraping against his brain. It was the feral sickness. The crushing, suffocating pressure of ruling an empire, compounded by severe insomnia. He had not slept more than 2 hours a night in 6 months. His breathing grew ragged. A low, inhuman growl tore from his throat. His bones ached, shifting dangerously beneath his skin as the beast demanded to be let out, demanded to hunt and tear and destroy. He stumbled away from the desk, knocking over a crystal decanter. It shattered against the hardwood floor. He was slipping. The darkness was swallowing him whole. Vaughn staggered into the hallway, clutching his pounding head. He needed to get to the isolation vault in the basement before he lost complete control and hurt his own family. He passed the guest wing, and then he heard it. It was a voice. Soft, melodic, and impossibly clear. Kerrigan was singing. It was a simple lullaby, something old and rhythmic, but the sound did not just travel through the air. It slipped beneath the heavy oak door and slid directly into Vaughn's veins. The effect was instantaneous. It was absolute biological shock. The agonizing pressure in his skull vanished. The frantic, bloodthirsty roaring of his wolf was immediately silenced, replaced by a deep, profound calm. The magic woven into her voice wrapped around his fractured mind, like a cooling, protective embrace. His erratic heart rate slowed to a steady, powerful thrum. Vaughn stood frozen in the dark corridor. The feral madness evaporated entirely. What took its place was a terrifying, all-consuming hunger. It was not a desire for blood. It was a desperate, clawing need for the source of that sound, for her. He did not knock. He wrapped his hand around the brass handle and pushed the door open. Moonlight spilled across the room. Kerrigan sat on the edge of the bed, her hand gently stroking Toby's hair as the boy slept beside Sienna. She stopped singing abruptly, her wide eyes darting to the doorway. Vaughn stood there, his chest heaving. The golden fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by an obsidian darkness of pure, unadulterated obsession. He stared at her, not as a king looking at a refugee, but as a starving man who had just found water. Chapter 3. "What are you?" Vaughn demanded. His voice was a raw, textured rasp that scraped against the quiet of the bedroom. He did not step over the threshold. The invisible barrier between them was charged with an electric, suffocating tension. Kerrigan stopped stroking her son's hair. Her heart performed a frantic, erratic flutter against her ribs. She looked at the towering alpha, bewildered. "I am a waitress, and I am tired. Please leave us alone." "Waitresses do not sing a king's madness to sleep," Gareth murmured, stepping out from the shadows of the hallway. The Gamma held an ancient, crumbling tome, bound in cracked leather. He did not look annoyed anymore. He looked deeply, profoundly unsettled. He bypassed Vaughn, walking straight toward the bed. He stopped at a respectful distance, opening the yellowed pages. "The scent of bleach and friar grease," Gareth said softly, looking at Kerrigan. "It was not just bad luck. It was a perfect accidental camouflage. You have been hiding in plain sight." "Hiding from what?" Kerrigan snapped, pulling the blanket higher over Toby. "From us. From them. From everyone," Vaughn answered. He finally crossed the threshold. The sheer temperature of his body seemed to warm the chilled room. "Explain it to her, Gareth." Gareth adjusted his glasses. "The book speaks of the lunar sirens. an extinct bloodline of human women who possessed a unique biological frequency. Their voices could weave magic. They could bend a wolf's will, incite a feral frenzy, or in your case, entirely cure it. Kerrigan stared at them as if they were both insane. Magic is a fairy tale. I am just a mother trying to pay rent. The rogues in the alley, Vaughn interrupted, his golden eyes narrowing. They were not there to kidnap my daughter. Sienna was merely the bait. He stepped closer to the bed, looking down at the sleeping boy. They wanted to force you out of the shadows, because a siren who bears a child creates a vessel of immense, untapped power. They want your son, Kerrigan, to breed an army that cannot be controlled. The blood drained entirely from Kerrigan's face. The room spun. The terrifying monsters from the alley were not a random encounter. They were hunting her baby. "No," she whispered, her hand shaking as she pulled Toby flush against her chest. "No, he is just a boy." "He is a target," Vaughn corrected. His voice softened, losing its sharp, commanding edge. "And until I annihilate every last rogue in this city, you are both staying here. Tomorrow you will learn how to defend yourself against my kind." The training began at dawn. The penthouse gym was a sprawling expanse of reinforced glass and padded black flooring. Kerrigan wore borrowed athletic clothes that hung loosely on her petite frame. Vaughn stood barefoot in the center of the mat, wearing only low-slung sweatpants. His torso was a landscape of brutal history. Pale, jagged scars crisscrossed over deeply defined muscle. He was a colossal apex predator, and yet he moved with the silent, fluid grace of falling water. "Your stance is too narrow," Vaughn instructed. He stepped behind her. Kerrigan gasped softly. The heat radiating from his skin was scorching. It felt as though she were standing with her back against an open furnace. "Widen your feet," he murmured. He did not wait for her to comply. Vaughn's large hands settled on her hips. His touch was firm, yet surprisingly gentle, treating her fragile human bones with absolute reverence. He physically shifted her hips, aligning her posture. Kerrigan's breath hitched. A hot, liquid jolt of electricity shot straight down her spine. The primal terror she had felt in the alley was gone, entirely replaced by a different, infinitely more dangerous kind of panic. "I cannot fight a wolf," Kerrigan whispered. Her voice trembled. "You will not have to overpower them," Vaughn replied. His chest brushed against her back as he leaned down. "You just need to buy yourself 3 seconds. 3 seconds is all I need to reach you." He reached forward, his arms bracketing hers to adjust her guard. He was effectively caging her against his body. The size difference was staggering. Kerrigan felt entirely enveloped. Vaughn closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. The wolf beneath his skin was pacing frantically, clawing at his chest, whining in profound distress. It wanted to turn her around. It wanted to bury its face in her neck and mark her territory. He inhaled slowly, trying to ground himself. The sharp, acidic tang of cheap lemon soap was fading away, washed off by her morning shower. Beneath it, a new scent was blooming. It was delicate, intoxicating, and impossibly sweet. Night-blooming jasmine soaked in raw, dark honey. Vaughn's heart slammed against his ribs. His fangs ached with a sudden, sharp pressure, demanding to drop from his gums. He tightened his grip on her arms, his breathing turning deliberately slow and deep. Kerrigan felt the sudden rigidness in his muscles. She felt the heavy, thudding rhythm of his heartbeat pressing against her shoulder blades. She did not pull away. Instinctively, irrationally, she leaned back into his solid chest. She tilted her head, exposing the pale, vulnerable line of her neck. A low, vibrating rumble started deep within Vaughn's chest. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated approval. He lowered his face, his nose brushing lightly against the sensitive skin just below her ear. "Vaughn," she breathed, her eyes fluttering shut. The intimate spell shattered with a deafening metallic crash. The ventilation grates above them exploded. Thick, acrid gray smoke billowed into the gym at a terrifying speed. It was not normal smoke. It smelled of sulfur and burning metal. Vaughn roared in immediate, blinding agony. He shoved Kerrigan behind him, coughing violently as the silver-laced gas seared his lungs. His skin hissed where the smoke touched it, leaving angry red burns. "Gareth!" Vaughn bellowed, his voice tearing. The reinforced gym doors burst open. Gareth sprinted into the room, his aristocratic demeanor entirely gone. His eyes were glowing a lethal, icy blue, and his hands had already morphed into lethal, dark claws. 3 figures clad in tactical black armor leaped through the shattered glass ceiling, landing silently on the mats. "They breached the lower security grid," Gareth shouted, slicing through the first assassin's throat in a spray of crimson. "The silver is neutralizing our healing. Get to the children," Vaughn ordered Kerrigan. He lunged forward, catching a silver blade with his bare, blistering hands and snapping the attacker's wrist. Kerrigan did not hesitate. She bolted out of the gym, sprinting down the smoke-filled corridor toward the guest wing. Her eyes watered profusely. Her lungs burned with every frantic breath. She burst into the bedroom. Sienna was huddled in the corner crying softly, but the bed was empty. "Toby!" Kerrigan screamed, panic seizing her throat. A shadow shifted near the balcony. The floor-to-ceiling window had been cleanly cut. Standing on the ledge was a towering rogue, its mutated face twisted into a grotesque grin. In its massive, clawed hand, it held Toby by the scruff of his pajamas. "No, please!" Kerrigan lunged forward, her hands outstretched. The rogue did not even look at her. It simply stepped backward. Kerrigan crashed into the glass, her screams tearing through the penthouse as the monster and her son plummeted into the howling, storm-ravaged night. Chapter 4. The glass was still raining down like jagged diamonds when Vaughn tore into the bedroom. He did not ask questions. One look at the shattered balcony window and the blinding, suffocating terror radiating from Kerrigan told him everything. He lunged toward the precipice, looking down at the dizzying drop. The rogue was not falling. It was scaling the sheer glass exterior of the skyscraper, its colossal claws gouging deep trenches into the reinforced steel framework as it scrambled downward toward the city's bordering forest reserve, Toby dangling from its jaws like a rag doll. A sound tore from Vaughn's throat. It was not human. It was a guttural, earth-shaking vibration of absolute, murderous fury. He did not hesitate. Right in front of Kerrigan, the Alpha King surrendered entirely to the beast. It was a terrifying, violent symphony of snapping bones and shifting anatomy. His spine elongated, his muscles expanding exponentially, tearing through his sweatpants. Within seconds, the man was gone. In his place stood a nightmare of obsidian fur and lethal muscle. He was easily the size of a draft horse, a primeval deity of war and shadow. The wolf turned his massive golden eyes toward Kerrigan. He dropped low, flattening his stomach against the carpet, and let out an urgent, demanding bark. "Get on." Kerrigan did not let the paralyzing fear take hold. Her son was out there. She scrambled onto the beast's broad back, her hands sinking deep into his coarse, scorching fur. She locked her trembling thighs around his ribs. The moment she was secure, the wolf launched them off the balcony. The descent was a breathless, terrifying free fall. The howling wind whipped the breath from Kerrigan's lungs. Vaughn did not plummet blindly. His powerful hind legs kicked against the building's structural beams, ricocheting off architectural ledges to break their momentum. They hit the pavement with a force that jarred Kerrigan's teeth, but the wolf's anatomy absorbed the brunt of the impact. He did not break stride. He exploded into a sprint, chasing the rogue's trail straight into the dense black timberland bordering the city. The forest was a chaotic labyrinth of whipping branches and blinding darkness. The storm raged overhead, unleashing a torrential downpour that quickly flooded the woodland floor. Kerrigan clung to Vaughn for absolute survival. Riding him was a revelation of raw, terrifying power. Beneath her, every flex of his colossal muscles, every thunderous strike of his paws against the mud, translated into a kinetic shockwave. She pressed her face against the thick scruff of his neck. The heat rolling off his body was a burning furnace against the freezing rain. In the heart of this nightmare, holding onto a monster, she had never felt safer. The rain was a violent baptism. As they tore through the flooded woods, the torrential water mercilessly scrubbed away the harsh chemical residue on Kerrigan's skin. The stale grease, the caustic lemon bleach, the layers of poverty and exhaustion she had worn like armor, it all dissolved into the mud. Freed from its artificial prison, her true scent finally bloomed in the damp air. It started as a faint whisper, a delicate ribbon of night-blooming jasmine steeped in raw, dark honey. But as her body heat rose from the adrenaline, the fragrance exploded outward, impossibly sweet and intoxicatingly rich. Beneath her, the giant wolf faltered, just for a microsecond. Vaughn's stride hitched, his claws skidding against the wet earth. His lungs dragged in a deep, shuddering breath, filling his senses with a scent that struck his brain like a bolt of lightning. The feral madness that usually clouded his mind during a hunt was instantly obliterated. A sudden, violent possessiveness flared in his chest, so intense it bordered on physical agony. But there was no time to process the revelation. Through the curtain of rain, the silhouette of a rusted, abandoned logging mill loomed ahead. The rogue had stopped running. It stood in the center of the muddy clearing, cornered by the flooded river. Toby lay crumpled on the wet ground a few yards away, crying for his mother. Vaughn skidded to a halt, baring his lethal, elongated fangs. He let out a low, menacing rumble that vibrated straight through Kerrigan's core. She slid off his back, her knees instantly sinking into the icy mud. "Toby!" she screamed, taking a frantic step forward. The rogue snarled, its diseased fur bristling. It knew it could not defeat the Alpha King in a head-on collision. It needed a distraction. With a horrifying burst of speed, the mutant beast bypassed Vaughn and lunged directly toward the crying child. "No!" Kerrigan shrieked. She did not wait for the Alpha. She threw her fragile human body across the mud, sliding between the monster and her son. She curled her arms around Toby, burying his face in her chest, shielding him with her own back. The rogue's claws swiped down in a brutal, sweeping arc. Vaughn hit the creature a fraction of a second later, his jaws locking around the rogue's spine with a sickening crunch. He violently dragged the beast away, but he was a heartbeat too late. The tip of the rogue's claw had caught Kerrigan's upper arm. Fabric tore, flesh parted. A deep, jagged laceration opened from her shoulder to her elbow. Kerrigan gasped, collapsing onto her side. Hot crimson blood spilled down her arm, rapidly mixing with the rain and the mud. The metallic tang of copper hit the air. It fused perfectly with the overwhelming, intoxicating scent of jasmine and honey. The unique, undeniable biological signature of her blood crashed into Vaughn's senses. The Alpha King dropped the paralyzed rogue. He froze entirely. The rain pelted his dark fur, but he stood as still as a stone statue. He turned his massive head slowly, his glowing golden eyes locking onto the bleeding woman huddled in the mud. The truth, the impossible, world-shattering truth, rewired his very soul in a single heartbeat. The fragile human he had dismissed, the woman carrying the scent of bleach, the siren whose voice conquered his madness. She was his. A sound erupted from the wolf. It was not a growl. It was a roar so profound, so earth-shattering, it seemed to split the storm clouds above. It was a declaration of absolute primal ownership that echoed across the entire valley. Mate. Chapter 5. The word mate did not just echo. It shattered the very foundation of the forest. The declaration was a seismic event, a shockwave of ancient magic that ripped through the storm. For a decade, the Alpha King of the Obsidian Crag had been a monarch without a queen, a soul slowly fracturing under the weight of absolute solitude. And now, she was here, bleeding in the mud. Vaughn did not just lose control, he annihilated it. The feral sickness that had plagued his mind for months finally breached the gates. But this was not the madness of a dying king. It was the apocalyptic wrath of a mate protecting his own. More mutated figures slithered from the tree line. The rogue they had chased was not alone. It was merely the vanguard of a hunting pack. 5 colossal, diseased wolves encircled the clearing, their yellow eyes fixed on the bleeding human and her child. They did not get a chance to strike. Vaughn hit the first rogue like a falling meteor. The collision produced a sickening crunch of collapsing ribs. He did not fight with the calculated precision of a trained warrior. He fought like a starving, apocalyptic god. He tore through muscle and sinew, his jaws snapping spines with terrifying, effortless brutality. The rain turned crimson. Kerrigan clutched Toby against her chest, pressing her hand over his eyes. Her own arm throbbed with a searing, blinding agony, but she could not look away. The violence was mesmerizing. It was horrifying, and yet it was entirely for her. Within 90 seconds, the clearing was a graveyard of torn flesh and shattered bone. The 5 rogues were utterly decimated, but the silence that followed was worse than the battle. Vaughn stood in the center of the carnage. His midnight fur was matted with thick, dark gore. His chest heaved with violent, erratic gasps. The golden light in his eyes had vanished, swallowed entirely by a bottomless, pitch-black void. The threat was dead, but the beast was still awake, and it was starving for more violence. A silver blur burst through the underbrush. Gareth skidded into the clearing, fully shifted into a sleek, gray wolf, followed by 2 elite guards. They had tracked the Alpha's trail. Vaughn whipped his colossal head around. He did not recognize his Gamma. He did not recognize his own soldiers. He saw only predators entering his territory, entering her territory. A low demonic snarl ripped from Vaughn's throat. He crouched, his muscles coiling tight, preparing to slaughter his own men. Gareth immediately dropped his belly to the mud, whining in absolute submission. But it was useless. The Alpha King was gone. He was feral. "Vaughn!" Kerrigan screamed. The giant black wolf did not flinch. He took a predatory step toward the gray wolves. Kerrigan's breathing turned jagged. Her blood was leaving her body too fast, making her dizzy, but the maternal, desperate instinct surged back to life. She could not let him destroy his own family. She could not let the beast consume the man who had saved her son. She forced herself up onto her knees. She ignored the burning pain in her arm, the freezing rain, and the terrifying monsters surrounding her. She closed her eyes, drew in a deep, trembling breath, and opened her mouth. She sang, It was not the quiet, soothing lullaby from the bedroom. This was a primal, ancient invocation. The notes tore from her throat, cutting through the howling wind like a blade of pure silver. It was a frequency that human ears could barely process, but to the wolves, it was an overwhelming physical force. The magic rolled across the clearing in a suffocating, invisible wave. Gareth and the guards instantly collapsed into the mud, entirely paralyzed by the sheer, commanding weight of the siren's voice. Vaughn froze mid-stride. The pitch-black void in his eyes violently fractured, bleeding back into a luminous, stunned gold. The song wrapped around his fractured mind, forcefully dragging the human consciousness back to the surface. It was a brutal exorcism of his own violent nature. He let out a pathetic, broken whimper. The colossal beast swayed on its paws. Right before Kerrigan's eyes, the terrifying monster began to shrink. Bones snapped and reformed. Fur melted into pale, scarred skin. Within seconds, the nightmare was gone. Vaughn collapsed into the freezing mud, completely human, entirely naked and violently trembling. He was breathing heavily, his broad chest rising and falling as he stared at his blood-soaked hands. Then he looked up, his gaze locked onto Kerrigan. She was still kneeling, pale and shivering, her blood dripping onto the grass. The Alpha King, the most feared predator in the continent, did not stand up. He crawled. He dragged his battered body across the wet earth, entirely oblivious to the cold and the gore. He reached her, collapsing at her knees. He wrapped his powerful, trembling arms around her waist and buried his face directly into her stomach. "I am sorry," Vaughn choked out. His voice was a raw, shattered rasp. "I am sorry. Please, do not fear me. Please." Kerrigan looked down at the towering, terrifying man weeping against her battered body. The power dynamic of the entire world had just inverted. He was a king, a billionaire, a monster of myth, and yet he was tethered to her very soul, begging a penniless waitress for salvation. Slowly, gently, Kerrigan raised her uninjured hand. She buried her fingers deep into his wet, dark hair. "I am right here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I am not going anywhere." Vaughn let out a shuddering breath, pulling her and Toby fiercely against his chest. For the first time in his life, the Alpha King felt completely, terrifyingly safe. 40 minutes later, the illusion of safety shattered. Gareth had provided a heavy wool coat for Vaughn and hastily bandaged Kerrigan's arm. The elite guards had escorted them back to the city, bypassing the damaged penthouse and entering the heavily fortified ground-floor lobby of the Obsidian Corporation headquarters. The expansive marble atrium was completely silent, but it was not empty. A dozen unfamiliar wolves stood in perfect military formation. They wore crisp, crimson uniforms, the undeniable colors of the Supreme Wolf Council. Standing at the forefront was a tall, severe woman with icy blue eyes. She held a scroll sealed with black wax. Vaughn's posture instantly shifted from a protective lover back to a lethal monarch. He pushed Kerrigan slightly behind him, his jaw setting into a brutal line. "Envoy," Vaughn growled, his voice echoing off the marble. "You are trespassing in my territory." The woman did not bow. She unrolled the scroll, her gaze flicking dismissively over Vaughn to land squarely on Kerrigan. "Alpha King Vaughn," the envoy stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. "By decree of the High Council, the ancient laws stand. The siren bloodline is an abomination. It is a biological weapon that threatens our entire species." She raised her chin, her icy eyes narrowing. "Hand over the woman and the child for immediate execution, or the entire Obsidian Kingdom will be leveled to ash by sunrise." Chapter 6. Vaughn did not cower. He did not negotiate. The Alpha King looked at the Supreme Council's death warrant, and he laughed. It was a dark, terrifying sound that echoed off the polished marble walls. The sheer force of his amusement sent a visible shiver down the spines of the crimson-clad guards. "You dare mock the High Council," the envoy hissed, her icy composure fracturing. "You risk total annihilation for a human anomaly?" Vaughn stopped laughing. The lethal, predatory stillness returned to his posture. He turned his back on the envoy entirely, dismissing her existence, and focused solely on Kerrigan. She stood shivering slightly in the oversized wool coat, her wounded arm tightly bound. But she did not look fragile anymore. The terrified waitress from the alley was dead. In her place stood a woman who had just subjugated a mythical beast with a single note. Vaughn stepped into her space. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her pale face. "They want to erase you," Vaughn murmured. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones. "They think you are a weapon. They are wrong. You are the entire kingdom." Kerrigan looked up into his luminous golden eyes. The undeniable gravitational pull of the mate bond hummed violently between them. It was a physical tether, pulling her soul directly into his. She did not feel fear. She felt an overwhelming, consuming certainty. "Show them," Kerrigan whispered. She deliberately let the wool coat slip from her uninjured shoulder. She tilted her head back, offering him the delicate, unbroken expanse of her neck. The pulse jumping beneath her skin was a frantic, erratic drumbeat. Vaughn's breathing hitched. A low, vibrating growl tore from his chest. His fangs descended, sharp and gleaming under the atrium lights. He wrapped one arm around her waist, pulling her flush against the scorching heat of his body. He did not hesitate. He sank his fangs deep into the junction of her shoulder and neck. Kerrigan gasped. A sharp, brilliant spike of pain pierced her flesh, but it was instantly swallowed by a blinding rush of pure ecstasy. The venom mixed with her bloodstream, igniting her veins with liquid fire. The scent of rain and crushed pine flooded her senses. Simultaneously, her siren magic flared to life. It did not fight the Alpha's claim. It welcomed it. A visible shockwave of silver and gold energy erupted from their joined bodies. The sheer kinetic force of their mating bond shattered every glass fixture in the grand lobby. The Crimson Guard stumbled backward, shielding their eyes from the blinding magical surge. Vaughn slowly withdrew his fangs. He dragged his tongue over the puncture wounds, sealing the mark with a tender, possessive swipe. When Kerrigan opened her eyes, the golden light of the Alpha King reflected perfectly in her own irises. The bond was locked. She was Luna. The envoy stared in absolute horror. "You have doomed us all. She is a heretic." A deafening gunshot silenced the woman's screaming. Gareth stood to the side, casually lowering a smoking, silver-plated revolver. The ancient wax-sealed death warrant in the envoy's hand was completely obliterated, blown into a shower of burning confetti. "The king has made his ruling," Gareth said smoothly. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, his tone dripping with lethal politeness. "I suggest you vacate our territory before I lose my temper and ruin another perfectly good suit." The envoy looked at the smoking paper, then at the towering, terrifying couple. She swallowed hard, spun on her heel, and marched her soldiers out into the storm. 3 weeks later, the morning sun poured through the newly reinforced windows of the penthouse. The lingering smell of ozone and blood was entirely gone. The space smelled of expensive roasted coffee, blooming jasmine, and the warm, chaotic scent of family. "Hold still, young man," Gareth sighed in profound exasperation. He was kneeling on the plush ivory rug, attempting to fasten a miniature silk bow tie around Toby's neck. Sienna was already dressed in a tailored pale blue dress, giggling as she chased a robotic toy across the floor. "It is too tight," Toby complained, tugging at the collar. "It is Italian silk, Tobias," Gareth corrected, smoothing the fabric with meticulous care. "You are a prince of the Obsidian Crag now. We do not wear polyester." Out on the sprawling glass balcony, Kerrigan leaned against the railing. She held a steaming mug of tea, the morning breeze gently lifting her dark hair. Her posture was relaxed, her spine perfectly straight. The mating mark on her neck had healed into a beautiful, silver-tinged crescent. A familiar, scorching heat bracketed her back. Vaughn stepped up behind her, wrapping his massive arms around her waist. He pulled her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. He inhaled deeply, completely intoxicated by the scent of honey and jasmine that now belonged exclusively to him. "Are you ready?" Vaughn murmured, his deep voice vibrating against her skin. "The entire pack is waiting below for the presentation ceremony." Kerrigan leaned her head back against his broad shoulder. She looked down at the sprawling city, a territory that now answered to her very heartbeat. She had spent her entire life scrubbing floors, hiding in the shadows, fighting a war she never understood. Now she stood in the sunlight, anchored by the most powerful creature in the world. "Let them wait a few more minutes," Kerrigan whispered softly, turning in his arms to press a lingering, tender kiss against his jaw. "The king and queen are busy." Vaughn smiled, a rare, breathtaking expression that reached his golden eyes. He tightened his grip on his mate, pulling her closer into the warmth of their newly forged empire. The storm was finally over. The reign of the siren had just begun.